we have got, instead, we're going to hear from Carolina Isaacson from VTI. She's a senior researcher at the Swedish National Road and Transport Institute and also adjunct professor at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. And her talk, you can see here the title, so I will let her begin.
Thank you, and I will also put on my camera. I realized I didn't do that. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Tina, for introducing me so nicely. I'm Carolina, and as you said, I'm from VTI in Sweden and also KTH, so I'm basically colleague to Harriet. And my presentation builds on work that I have been carrying out together with colleagues at VTI. And the presentation here today is a synthesis of research in two different projects, where one had a focus on national transport planning and the other one on local transport planning in the Swedish context. And in our work, we have wanted to understand more of the links and the tensions between local and national transport planning for sustainable and decarbonized transport planning. And the outline of the presentation is as follows. I will start to say something about the background, of course, and then try to move on as quickly as I can to the findings and then reflections and ways forward. And some of the background. I mean, basically, I think the picture is similar in Sweden as from what I've heard from Britain and many other European contexts and also over the world, that transport is a big issue when it comes to climate impact, and there is a really need for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from transport. It accounts currently for about 30% of the Swedish domestic greenhouse gas emissions, and even more, around 40 if we also count transport that we do abroad. And since 2017, we have a new policy target that says that the emissions from the transport sector shall be reduced with 70% until 2030. And the overall Swedish ambition is to become fossil-free by 2045. But as you probably guess, and also as Tina started to say here, progress is too slow. Basically, we need a reduction somewhere around 9, 10, maybe even 11% per year to meet these goals. But the reduction was around 2% 2019, all over the years 2010 up to 2019, around 20%. Last year, that was maybe more in line with how it should look, but we don't know if that's something that will stay. So yeah, there's a need to change things rapidly. And there are also many other policy goals in Sweden that are related to climate. And for instance, we have an overall transport policy goal that also relates to climate and other sustainable development goals and so on. But there's also a new strategy in the Swedish transport policy context that is basically talking about the three legs of transport transformation. And the three legs are, first of all, improved energy efficiency of vehicles. Secondly, higher share of renewable fuels. And the third one, transport efficient society. And I think that the third leg here is quite interesting from a transport planning perspective, because that really relates to potentially more transformative ideas about reducing the need for, reducing traffic volumes, introducing more restrictive measures against car use, focusing on a strong and rapid modal shift, and so on. So it's a potentially transformative approach. As you can see, I have my notes in my lap here, so that's why I'm looking down sometimes. And I would say also that the first two legs are the ones that has dominated the discussions and the work so far. The standard focus on technical developments, new fuels, and so on. And I mean, of course, that's important, but I think it's really interesting to think of also how what a transport efficient society could look like. And what we wanted to explore in our projects was to to see to what extent these types of ideas have started to what extent we can see them among local transport planners and also in national transport planning. So the aim of our research and the presentation today is to examine the links and tensions between local and national transport planning in their efforts to implement a decarbonated transport system with a focus on this idea of transport efficient society, and a specific focus on how national transport planning affects local policy and planning. Something brief about the projects. Basically, as I said from the beginning, 2 research projects where we are trying to synthesize the results now. The first of them was led by my colleague Karin Thoresson, and that project focused clearly on the local transport planning arena. It was an in-depth exploration of conditions for local transport planning, quite strongly focused towards restrictive measures against car use. The second project was run by me and my colleagues Linnea, Jakob, Christina, and the other Jakob. That was focused on climate policy integration in national transport planning, and that in that project we worked with the power framework as well. A brief note also on transport planning in Sweden before we move on to a few words about the theoretical framework and method and also the results. Basically, I guess it's similar to many other national contexts, but in Sweden there is of course a national level that decides the overall policy direction, takes investment decisions regarding national infrastructure. The formal power lies with the national government, but in practice, significant parts of the work, both the strategic work and the actual planning, is delegated to the Swedish Transport Administration. So they are responsible for preparing long-term infrastructure plans and also suggestions for investment decisions. Basically, the national level has the main resources also for transport developments, and is often co-funder of regional and local developments too. The regional level is responsible for regional public transport planning, some infrastructure as well, and the local planning controls land use and traffic planning within its own territory, but is also, as I said, often dependent on the national level to get funding for more, larger investments or new redirections of planning practice. A few words also about the theoretical framework. We were inspired by a multi-level governance perspective, but to be honest, we didn't explore that in detail. That is more a background framework because we have, there's a lot of the links and relations between different administrative levels when it comes to transport governance. What was more influential for us in our work was a critical policy analysis framework. So what we try to do is to go into the contextual dimensions, the norms, the perspectives, the meaning making that is going on at the different planning levels with a focus on local and national planning. We have used a qualitative research approach with a focus on qualitative interviews and document analysis. And when it comes to the interviews, we have done interviews with local planners and local politicians and also national transport planners. We also did some document analysis in our work. And you may interrupt me if there's any question for clarification, of course. Yes, what did we find then? When it comes to the local transport planning arena, of course, it varies depending on who you interview and his or her specific experience. So, and their specific roles and what municipality they work in. I should also say that the 3 municipalities that my colleague Karin focused on are municipalities that are of medium size in the Swedish context and also known to be quite ambitious in terms of strategies for sustainable transport and so on. In general, we found that the local planners support the idea of a transformed transport system. The exact meaning of this seems to vary, of course, and also the ideas of exactly how urgent it is and so on. But in general, the transport planners that we interviewed, they refer to modal shift as an important issue. They refer to climate change as very, very important. They see car restrictive measures as essential, and so on. But they also tell a lot about political resistance, both among citizen groups and also the difficulties they have to have a good dialogue with the politicians of what type of measures to move on with to meet climate targets. And the local politicians, they are clearly hesitant, I would say, to trying to change the transport system and individual mobility rapidly. They're very hesitant, especially to the use of restrictive measures, for instance, parking and so on. They tend to refer to the current transport system as the natural thing, and what we need to be responsive to the needs of local citizens. And the citizens that they refer to most often are also citizens in cars, while other groups are mentioned less often. And they see the need to change, but does not refer to this as anything extremely urgent. When it comes to national transport planning, the local planners, they refer to national transport planning as a potentially very important arena for them to find support and both knowledge support, but also incentives and motivation to use in their local work. But currently it's understood to be less helpful with the national planning level due to its focus on road infrastructure and accessibility for cars. And one of the planners that we interviewed said that there's a need for more common ground. It makes me desperate. We base our work on existing knowledge. We produce knowledge support regarding what we do and the impact it leads to. But still, when it's time for the next project, we need to redo everything. And this is something that comes out strongly from the interviews, that the local planners are often very, knowledgeable and follows the latest research and so on, but they find it hard to build a common ground and to agree on the most basic things about the urgency and the need for rapid change and so on. Yeah, at the national transport planning level, some of our key findings. Also here, I should say that it differs, of course, depending on each individual and so on. But in general, first of all, not listed here on the slide, but climate mitigation is defined as important and urgent also here in general, I would say, in the policy documents and in the interviews. No challenge about the need to meet climate targets and so on. So there's a general support for these overall goals and ambitions, but the national transport planning arena is still characterized by a quite conventional approach to transport planning, with a focus on transport infrastructure rather than behavior change. There's also a strong trust in models. Ideas of ever-increasing traffic volumes remain strong, and it seems difficult or even out of the question to imagine something different than the transport system that we have, also among the planners. Not everyone, but the ones we have interviewed are the ones who have been in leading positions for the long-term national transport planning process. And the planners and also senior managers at the Swedish Transport Administration also questions the role of infrastructure planning when it comes to decarbonisation. They think that climate mitigation should rather be carried out by electrification and renewable fuels, which is then the first two legs of the national strategy. And any significant mitigation potentials of planning and modal shift are dismissed quite effectively in the discussions and in the interview quotations. There has been several attempts to develop scenarios from the last two rounds of national planning that point at the need for more significant transformation and other planning directions. For instance, there has been attempts to use more goal fulfilling backcasting scenarios and so on. But those have been marginalized from the main process. And there's also recurring demands for more evidence on exact impact relations and more generalizable results from any suggestion to do things differently. The concluding reflections. What we found and what we have discussed quite much in our team is that what we see is that at the local level, there are at least signs of ambitions to do things differently. It's not that it is happening, but there are signs of a willingness, especially among the planners, but political resistance is a remaining challenge. And therefore, I think that the trust and the link between planners and politicians seem critical. Probably also new forms of citizen engagement, but we haven't had the focus on that in our work. But the link and the trust between the planners and the politicians seems crucial for moving on from where we are today. We also see that the local level would benefit strongly from more support, motivation, and incentive structures from the national planning level. And there are some such initiatives going on, I should say, but these are still quite specific and small in relation to the main bulk of national transport investments. So the conventional approach still permits national transport planning, and I think that is quite problematic. It basically discourages local ambitions to do things differently and hinders transformative capacity to be developed. And a key factor for the tensions that we see is related to the knowledge perspectives that permit national transport planning and investment decisions. The demand of exact evidence whenever there is an idea to do something differently than the standard demand satisfaction approach is a problem, also considering the limited time we have to decarbonate the transport system. So what we think that there is a need for is more crisis awareness among all political levels, and also a new type of transport planning where transformation is the natural starting point rather than something that should be solved somewhere else or later. And to develop that planning capacity, there is also a need for a more developed political imagination, I would say, and also other planning methods for exploring other possible futures. So that was my last slide. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for Carolina. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about the problems, politics, and policies of decarbonisation in the polycentric city region, as it says there. A little bit of the foci of this presentation, what I'm going to be talking about. It's going to be about challenges and pathways or possible interventions towards decarbonisation, really on the local level here. So this research approaches from a very governance perspective, from the premise that transport planning is highly complex in terms of institutional arrangements, actors, competing priorities, and of course, policy legacies. So despite recognition of this increasingly complex nature, the techno-rational model pervades both the policy-making environment in the UK and the field of transport research. And this quite simply oversimplifies the policy-making process. So this research responds to the call to employ more political science-oriented approaches to research, and thus expand understanding of policy-making processes, providing tools to support the shift to more sustainable transport systems in the UK and beyond. This research also starts from the idea that in order to understand more about what we need to do to decarbonise, we have to first make sense of some of the political realities in the decision-making environment. So it's kind of taking a step back here. This research was conducted in a specific context called the Polycentric city region. So it's a single case study, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, and was conducted majoritively last summer through a series of semi-structured interviews. So a political science-based approach, what do I mean? So this study primarily draws on the field of agenda setting research and to understand some of the core structures and dynamics of the pre-decision phase of transport policy making. So the majority of agenda setting based research focuses on how governments that have limited rationality prioritize between different competing public issues. So studying this process helps us to understand how the political forces work and illuminate some of the potential for winners and losers in the democratic structure. So another base starting point for this research was that in many places, the climate crisis as a problem and sustainable mobility or decarbonisation as a policy alternative or solution is not yet a question of implementation, but of recognition and commitment. So this justifies the focus on agenda setting or the more pre-decision phase of the policy-making process. So one of the most widely used and distinctive theoretical approaches for studying the agenda setting process is Kinger's multiple streams framework. This framework helps enable the explanation of some of the key forces driving policymaker attention and the specification of alternatives. And here, within the context of decarbonisation, how and why particular policies may gain attention at certain moments in time, where others may fail to materialise entirely on the local transport agenda. So a little introduction to the multiple streams framework. So essential structure of the MSF, what you need to understand is that it's of 3 separate process streams: problems, policies, politics. So the problem stream on the left-hand side there consists of various issues or conditions that policymakers or citizens wish to be addressed. These are competing for policymaker attention. The policies stream consisting of public mood, pressure groups, electoral patterns or legislative changes perhaps. And there, the policy stream in the center, you're talking about policy alternatives or ideas that may float around, competing to gain recognition or be adopted. So these 3 independent streams can come together in the center there in a policy window. These could be critical moments in time, presenting the opportunity for agenda shift or major change to the transport policy. This is something I'm going to talk about a little more further on in the presentation, but policy entrepreneurs have a significant role to play in coupling these 3 streams together during the windows of opportunity. So this paper used a adapted or evolved version of this model to look at how policymaker attention was rationed, so the problems, which political forces are most influential at the subnational level, the politics, and which type of selection criteria determine the policy survival, so the policies. So a little bit more about the case study at hand. This is the Tees Valley City region. So this is our polycentric rural urban region. The Tees Valley City region was established in the 2015 devolution deal, formed from the previous Tees Valley Local Enterprise Partnership. So this devolution deal devolved responsibility to the combined authority for producing the local transport plan, determining transport priorities alongside significant funding for future transport investment. So the city region consists of 1 regional entity, the combined authority, with overall responsibility for strategic planning in transport, and 5 local unitary authorities, as you can see there. So I think the Tees Valley is spatially really quite interesting because it's made out of multiple urban and rural areas. So this distinguishes it from many of the other devolved city regional authorities in the UK based around 1 urban core. It's also socio-politically really quite fascinating. As the historic heartland of British coal and steel, the Tees Valley area has historically been overwhelmingly Labour leaning, but this has changed a lot in the past 10 years. You may have seen Hartlepool, one of the authorities there, which hit the news in the recent summer by-elections, where Labour suffered a historic defeat by the Conservatives. I think that's a really good example of some of the big changes that are happening in politics, the very politically dynamic context we see in the Tees Valley. So in terms of results, this research identifies some of the key forces shaping the agenda setting process in the Tees Valley, resulting in this model or diagram. What I want you to focus on here are the features in bold, which highlights some of the most important key forces or sub-elements of each of the streams in the context of the Tees Valley transport agenda. As a side note, you can see that a complete separation of the three streams, as previously explained, was not found to be entirely appropriate here in the Tees Valley. The streams interconnected at various points, and there was a really small group of actors involved, so that on a practical basis, these streams overlap significantly. So I'm going to briefly zoom in on what I think are three of the most important forces shaping the transport policy agenda. The first of these is budgetary constraints. So capacity to respond to transport problems was primarily limited by budgetary constraints, particularly on the local level. So this isn't particularly new, perhaps something you would expect, but following the austerity agenda, resources available both to assess and manage problems at the local level have significantly reduced. For local authorities in the Tees Valley, budgetary constraints seriously limit the scope for change, and subsequently the type of problem that can move up the agenda, which remain predominantly small scale or local maintenance issues. The second, local political mood. This is the broad alignment of the public towards certain issues or values to policy problems. This was identified to be of particular importance in the political stream. So councillors and officers interviewed were extremely sensitive to the local political climate. They described the mood as overwhelmingly concerned with issues of long-term decline and unemployment. The economic decline of the Northeast has had a really substantial and long-lasting impact on the residents of the Tees Valley, and really is inextricably connected to the sense of local identity, as one can understand. So multiple participants discussed how this also focused the political mood on an inward doorstep issue focus. The third force or factor I want to highlight here is the public acquiescence. So to be approved of by politicians, certain policies must be acceptable to the local public, and what's feasible varies across different contexts. Multiple participants refer to the specification of policy alternatives as a balancing act, where public priorities had to be really carefully managed to not stimulate further complaints. So I don't have time, a great deal of time in the scope of this presentation to go into substantial detail regarding policy windows and policy entrepreneurs, but it is worth mentioning for two key reasons. Firstly, to illustrate the role of narrative framing in opening up a window of opportunity, and secondly, to highlight the influence of the mayoral entrepreneur. So this paper primarily utilized the example of the Teesside International Airport to discuss the role of the policy entrepreneur. While I do acknowledge that aircraft traffic is often eliminated in the context of local transport systems, it's obviously a central element of international decarbonisation, thus deemed relevant here. So to provide a very brief overview, Teesside International, so in its previous manifestations, Durham Tees Valley Airport, pictured there, was in the 2010s on the brink of collapse after years of deterioration. A growing public concern over the airport actually led to the establishment of a lobby group to save the airport. The airport issue was then adopted by the underdog Conservative mayoral candidate as one of their campaign promises. And thus in 2018, that newly elected mayor brought the airport back into public ownership. Already an interesting move for a Conservative candidate. So this first lobby group in particular, the one key individual leading the lobby group, was central in bringing the airport issue into the public eye and thus pushing the issue up the local agenda. In the paper, I argue that this group did so by constructing a particular narrative, altering the definition of the issue in the public stream. The group managed to frame the airport as vital to the future of the Tees Valley, and that its loss would greatly damage the reputation of the area, discouraging future investment and devastating job prospects. This was a narrative that was extremely compatible with the dominant ideology and political mood in the Tees Valley at the time. So the mayor of the Tees Valley can be understood as the second policy entrepreneur involved in shaping this policy window, so pushing the airport up to the top of the transport agenda. Ahead of this first mayor elections, the underdog Conservative candidate acted as a purposeful opportunist. He perceived a window of opportunity to increase his chances of success and thus campaigned around this current emotive local issue. Through personal connections, leadership skills, and negotiation strategies, all the typical attributes of a successful policy entrepreneur, the TVCA mayor has continued to act as a policy entrepreneur and able to react to changes in local political mood and push certain proposals for policy change to the top of the transport agenda. So let us now situate these findings within the discussion of transport decarbonisation. So given the clear policy imperative, one may have expected decarbonisation to have moved to the forefront of the local transport agenda, but as you were guessing, it has not. Whilst participants noted a slow shift towards sustainable mobility, in not one case was it referred to as a priority. You might have heard it before, but a lot of participants use the phrase lip service to describe policymakers' approach to the tangible policy change we were looking for. So building on my model of transport agenda setting in the Tees Valley, I identified 3 tentative mechanisms which may explain why decarbonisation has thus far been prevented from rising up the policy agenda. The first of these is public opinion. This mechanism sits at the intersection between public acquiescence, feedback, and local mood, which were found to be some of those most influential elements of the policy-making process. In short, the local public opinion on transport is dominated by 2 factors: the strong interest in local doorstep issues as opposed to strategic problems, and the dominance of the private car, of course. The short-term nature of the democratic political environment when councillors were really focused on re-election and generally reluctant to pursue any programmes perceived as politically contentious. The second here, ambiguity, accountability, that focus primarily on the pivotal role ambiguity plays in reducing institutional accountability. So due to a political environment of significant ambiguity, uncertainty, and policymaker turnover, local politicians here lacked both expertise and impetus needed to take responsibility for shifting the local transport agenda towards decarbonisation. The sense of ambiguity was heightened by a lack of detailed understanding on the link between transport and the climate crisis on behalf of elected individuals. That's not to say that they weren't interested and thoughtful when it came to talking about sustainable mobility, but that there was a little bit of a confusion between the links of the things that made the most emissions and the really important focus areas. So this ambiguity around the decarbonisation, I think, generated a problem of accountability also in the combined authority. Officers working in the Tees Valley were generally, oh, apologies, I've just gone to my next slide, that's why I'm confused. Generally, the problem with officers in the Tees Valley is that they were reluctant to take the first step or a leading role towards decarbonisation, instead acting with caution and waiting for local authorities to proceed or receive clear instructions from central government. So the third mechanism identified here was the growth agenda. The growth agenda was in part inherent in the ideology of the Tees Valley Combined Authority as a formal local enterprise partnership and the political leanings. It's also central to the ideology surrounding national transport investment and thus dominated the transport policy agenda in the Tees Valley, preventing any other issues from coming to the forefront. This isn't to say that green growth is entirely impossible. I think that's a controversial debate which lies outside this study, but that when they are in opposition with regards to investment, the growth agenda will continue to dictate both the recognition of problems and the specification of policy alternatives. Finally, in aiming to support the transition to a more sustainable transport system in the Tees Valley and beyond, this study highlights several means of or points of intervention in the subnational agenda setting process. First and foremost, I think the findings point to the potential of the combined authority, the city region, as a structure for promoting regional autonomy in transport policy. For local authorities in the Tees Valley, budgetary constraints seriously limit the scope for change. Yet the situation in the combined authority was one of somewhat greater autonomy of strategic direction, some more legislative power, and a small amount of resource independence. Participants also noted that despite the presence of local authority leaders on the strategic transport agenda, the combined authority dominated the decision-making environment. A key element to highlight here is the role of the mayor, as we mentioned earlier. This case studies demonstrated how influential that city regional mayor role can be. And that's something we've seen in other case studies, for example, in the Liverpool City region and Manchester City region, that mayor could play a really important role in pushing decarbonisation to the forefront of the agenda. I hope that we can look in future research to develop tools to support the combined authorities to exercise autonomy for more radical approaches to decarbonisation. Secondly, this research points to the crucial role officers can play in educating and supporting elected officials on the relationship between transport policy and the climate crisis. It could encourage some greater responsibility for agenda shift and enable this to be effectively communicated to the policy, to the local electorate. Finally, last but not least, in illustrating the importance of narrative construction for problem recognition, this study suggests that reframing decarbonisation and sustainable mobility as a tool for very local-oriented growth and job creation has the potential to gain greater public support within the current political climate here in somewhere like the Tees Valley. Thank you so much for your time.
We're going to move on now to our next speaker. So this is Louise Reardon from the University of Birmingham. Louise is a senior lecturer in governance and public policy at the Institute of Local Government Studies. And she is going to speak to us about network governance and the decarbonisation of transport. And her co-author, Timea Notcher, is also going to be presenting. So they're going to do a double act.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Share my screen. Okay, is that in presenter view?
Yes.
Checking. Okay, brilliant. Okay, yeah, delighted to be part of this panel today with presenting some work from our project funded by the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. So Timea and I are going to present one aspect of our project, which is around network analysis at the city region level that Timea has been leading on. And we're going to present our emerging analysis of this and provide you with 4 red flags or warning signs that are emerging from our analysis that we think are potential barriers or stumbling blocks to rapid decarbonisation of transport. So Decarbonate Network and many others have been really leading at the forefront of arguing that we need to take place-based approaches to transport, and at the local level is incredibly important to shifting the dial on transport decarbonisation. Recognising that this is within a multi-level governance context where regional, national, supranational organisations and actors are incredibly important, and they can facilitate or constrain local level activity. So we need to understand that relationship. The entry point for us with this project is that actually, though, much of that work focuses on the formal rules, responsibilities, powers that organisations have. So, for example, tax levering powers, budget controls, and other policy levers. And while they're incredibly important, I'm not dismissing those, we know that no matter what sort of official formal governance arrangements we have, be they federal, highly centralised, quasi-federal, there's still lots of work across all different contexts that needs to be done to rapidly decarbonise. So this is our starting point for thinking, actually, while the formal sort of responsibilities and rules are important, and indeed they take up most of the kind of public agenda around local, we actually need to understand a little bit more about how people working in these systems interpret their roles. So we need to have more recognition of people's understanding of their situated agency. So the way that power is influenced by the context in which people are working, and importantly, how they interpret their power within different contexts. So our real question is, how can we better understand the implications of governance dynamics, these multi-level dynamics that arise from actors' perceptions, interactions, and networks that can then facilitate policy change towards low carbon mobility? So we're taking as our kind of theoretical lens the recognition that local and place-based approaches are situated within these multi-level and multi-actor governance systems, that these systems are networked, and Tamir will go into this in more detail, i.e. there are exchange relationships that happen between different people and different organisations, be that in terms of information, resources, etc. But importantly for us, we're really interested in that decentered aspect of governance, which recognises situated agency and the capacity of governable subjects, which we all are, to challenge dominant policy and political narratives by thinking and acting otherwise. And we're here drawing on the work of Finlayson and others, where analysis is directed at the ways in which actors' traditions and beliefs cause them to construct situations in differing ways and to plot differing courses of action. So really, how do people understand their role in this complex governance system? So within this project, we're doing a comparative analysis of two city regions, Birmingham and Cambridge. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus in on Birmingham, and we can discuss the other in questions if that's interesting. But Birmingham is the UK's second largest city. It's got 1.1 million inhabitants, 4 million in the wider metropolitan region. And it's got the largest local authority in Europe. So it's got 120 councillors, and it employs over 5,000 people. So I think when we're talking about local authorities taking action, or a combined authority taking action, we need to recognise that these organisations are incredibly big in some cases, or incredibly small, but they're very diverse organisations. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about a local authority, for example? So I think that's something to bear in mind. Tamir's going to talk in a moment about the network analysis and how that's been approached, but alongside that, we've been doing interviews with stakeholders across the city region to understand how they understand the problem of low carbon mobility and what they see their role is in taking action in relation to that. So we've been talking to policymakers, politicians, community organisers, third sector organisations and business groups about these kinds of issues. So I'll hand over to Tamir now, who's going to talk us through the interesting bit.
Thank you, Louise. As Louise mentioned, one aspect of this research is to use network analysis and also understand the usefulness of it in this context as an analytical tool to better understand the impact of situated agency on facilitating policy change in this multi-level and multi-actor governance setting. And the network analysis here is used to map the relevant organizations, their relationships to each other, that constitute the governance networks of low carbon mobility. Investigating the potential tensions and misalignments between the formal structural accounts of governance systems and then the network dynamics created by situated agency. This network analysis aims to identify the differences between network structures that are seen from the outside. So this is what we call the formal arrangements, and also from within through these actor interpretations, which is supposed to be about the situated agency issue. So the formal network structures are reconstructed using mainly secondary data, including from websites, local, regional, and national policy documents, and also minutes of meetings. And then the interpretive or informal networks are developed based on semi-structured interviews with actors from within the network, including elected politicians, policy makers from the local transport authorities, regional energy distributors, transport operators, infrastructure developers, charities, and other activist groups. And the interviews focus on how network actors perceive their position within the network vis-a-vis other actors, and also understand their role and powers to facilitate policy change and action given the associated constraining and enabling effects. And to facilitate this kind of discussions, we use so-called ego networks that are extracted from the formal network visualization, which I will talk about a bit more detail later. And so these ego networks are zooming into the interviewee's organization and ask questions about the nature and strengths of connections they have to other organizations, potentially missing connections that are not represented in the formal network, and also regarding their overall views about more or less important actors to achieve policy change locally. So Louise, can I have the next slide, please? So looking at the Birmingham case specifically, the network analysis started out with collecting structural information on large influential organizations such as Birmingham City Council, umbrella organizations that bring together a wide range of actors, for example, Innovation Alliance West Midlands, as well as membership organizations and collaborative decision-making arenas, for example, the Net Zero Transport Board from the national level. And so overall, 33 such umbrella organizations and arenas were identified to start reconstructing this formal network. Louise, next slide, please. And the data was at that initial stage collected as sort as a bipartite or two-mode network, which was then later converted into a one-mode network to be able to better understand and visualize different organizations and organizational units' relationships to one another. The undirected membership type links that were that I just mentioned were substituted by multiple directed edges representing influence traveling in different ways among the different organizational units and members of membership organizations and groups. Next slide, please. And then in the next step, additional directed edges were added to represent authority relationships. So for example, relating to internal hierarchical structure of public sector organizations, collaborations on projects. So for example, projects being delivered by external partners, and also flows of resources. So for example, information, advice, or funding. As well as issues such as person overlap. So for example, the same person leading a charity or an activist group and also being on multiple council committees. So these network edges then were assigned different weights based on the assumed strength of relationships. So there is a bit of an assumption there. For example, direct authority being potentially stronger as an influence than policy advice. And for those derived from umbrella organization memberships, the network edge weights also account for group sizes and decrease with increasing group size. So for example, a weight of the influence of each member of an advisory body on each other and also on the government organizations which they are advising is dependent on how many members an advisory body has. Next slide, please. So this one-mode formal network, which was constructed using GAPI, ultimately consists of 370 nodes representing different organizations and over 9,900 edges among them, which represent the different types of influence. And to represent these flows of various kinds of influence, as I mentioned, understood broadly, including authority information, resources, and also the impact of group memberships and organizational structures. The network is directed, and some nodes have multiple edges between them due to how the network was reconstructed. So here I visualize the network to show how these different organizations are operate on different levels in the multi-level context. So I think this quite well shows how, in fact, there are different multi-level interactions that are particularly interesting in this governance setting. This sort of visualization also indicates that the most relevant organizations operate on the metropolitan, so subnational regional level, which is perhaps less surprising given the regional integrated transport authority in the West Midlands, and also the West Midlands Combined Authority's role in delivering important transport infrastructure projects. In terms of, I like to look at where the actors come from that are included in the network, and there seems to be a relative balance between public and private sector organizations, and also 1/5 of the organizations belong either to research and academia, or to the third sector, which includes voluntary organizations and activist groups. And looking at some measures of centrality to bring out some findings from this type of analysis, which we can then further understand via qualitative research. So some of the organizations based on betweenness centrality that seem interesting or influential in the network include Sustainability West Midlands, which is a third sector organization, High Speed Rail 2, I guess I don't have to explain that much, Birmingham City Council's cabinet, and also National Grid, which is the local electricity distributor, as well as the national, and also Sustrans, which is a national walking and cycling charity. Next slide, please, Louise. And I also wanted to bring out another type of centrality, which is a weighted out degree, which essentially looks at who are those actors that have most influence of these different kinds of influential roles. That highlights the potentially influential position of elected politicians. So the cabinets of many local authorities and regional authorities have been quite interesting. The Transport and Connectivity Directorate within Birmingham City Council, as well as the University of Birmingham's Energy Institute. Next slide, please, Louise. And I just very briefly wanted to mention also the informal network, which is based on interviews. So for this visualization, I've only included 15 interviews so far, which are with public sector officers, third sector representatives, and also transport service providers. And we are also including interviews in the future from business and private sector and different levels. So this informal network is larger and consists of almost 400 nodes. So there were 26 new nodes added, which are organizations that haven't been traceable through formal arrangements, as well as 200 new edges. And these new additions overall don't seem to change the network structure, but they do highlight extensive collaboration and potential flows of influence among third sector voluntary organizations, which was not captured in the formal network. In contrast, the interviewees from the private and public sectors tended to mention formalized collaborative settings, such as working groups and advisory boards, as the main avenues for interactions and collaboration, which also appeared in the formal network. So the informal link also emphasized the influential role of certain, mostly third sector actors, such as Birmingham Friends of the Earth, who don't appear particularly well connected in the formal network. So those are just some emerging findings from the network analysis, and I give back the word to Louise there.
Thank you, Tamir. So this work is still ongoing, and so these findings have a very big caveat that they're emerging conclusions. But just linking all that rich analysis back to what this means then for rapid transport decarbonisation, what the analysis shows is that we've got this incredibly large network with authority and responsibility scattered over a diverse political and organisational landscape. And because of that, the issue then sits between lots of different levels, with the problem very broadly conceived and potentially indefined and understood. And also important influential actors such as politicians across head up all of these different organisations in a lot of ways, that then are sort of stifling progress. So we had a lot of our interviewees talking about the primacy of politics here, and we put a red flag next to this, not because we want to get rid of democracy, but just in thinking about actually how we can try and really convince our decision makers, who in this context are the councillors, the elected officials, of what needs to be done. So one of our interviewees said, for decision makers, it's still a balancing act between those who shout that we need to be radical and those who think we just switch 10% of the vehicle fleet to electric. So urgency is not the main narrative. So that's a real concern, is that, do our elected officials really get it? The second thing that comes out is that while we'll talk about the informal in a moment, public sector hierarchies remain really strong, and there's a real look by a lot of parties to people like the local authority. But what we see here is this second red flag or warning, that actually capacity is a real challenge. And what we see, particularly in the Birmingham context, is a kind of lost decade almost due to austerity. So one of our interviewees highlighted this well. The shrinking and abolition of the sustainability unit at the City Council completely cuts across the claims in various green commissions that they produced in the early part of the decade. They took a number of initiatives, but clearly the austerity impact really cut the ground from under them. And we only see now, literally in the last few months, that despite the council having really high profile initiatives around climate action, they're only now recruiting officers to work specifically on climate and decarbonisation. So there's a real question mark there about whether the capacity is there to affect change. And then our final two warnings. So what to me are highlighted there at the end is that we have a really rich informal network that points to extensive links and collaboration between third sector actors and voluntary groups, but that these aren't really captured in the formal governing arrangements and deliberation that happens in these kind of decision-making forum. And this raises two really important concerns for us. Is one, that we're not using the knowledge, expertise and capacity that we have on the ground to really help affect change. So we've spoken to some real experts on whole systems change, on their communities and what their communities' needs and wants are, that aren't really in the room and having these conversations. And this links back to Rebecca's whole point in the keynote this morning. And more fundamentally then, this really risks a democratic deficit and a lack of trust that people are actually going to deliver on the promises that they make, and actually that these promises are supported. So as one of our interviewees said, the major multi-million-pound investment decisions are made pretty much behind closed doors by small groups of people with a baked-in mindset about what's right and proper and what works or anything else. And the solutions are then imposed on people who have no say in the matter at all. And I think that's really important, going back to Rebecca's point this morning about how we can get the public on board. A lot of our interviewees take councillors as a proxy for the public. And I think that's also something that we need to think about as well. Are we actually speaking to the people in communities about what they want? So this... Sorry,
Louise, you need to finish up now.
I'm finishing now, yeah. So this is just to say that this is also preliminary, and we're doing a lot more work in this area, and hopefully be able to come back to you with a comparison with Cambridge and some other things in the future. Thank you.
I'll move on to our final talk of this session. Again, we're having a double act. We've got Thomas Haynes-Doran from the University of Leeds, and also Ercilia Villingeri from Oxford, who are two of the authors who are going to present to us today. And they're talking about rapid decarbonisation claims and actions. So over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah,
yes.
All good. Thank you. So Ercilia's going to be doing the second half of the presentation. She's got the slide power, so if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Ercilia, please. So to start our talk, we just want to reflect briefly on the government's publication of the Decarbonising Transport Strategy, and clearly it makes clear that the rate of decarbonisation that is currently taking place is far from adequate for meeting the current government net zero 2050 target, and that actually a lot needs to be done to change the course, the way things are going for transport. Next slide. So it claims that the strategy meets the 6 carbon budget set by the Climate Change Commission. It continues to hold that this can be done without changing consumption and travel patterns, however. People may have picked up on a lot of heavy lifting done by new technology, and that sort of thing, jet zero, that kind of thing. So there's a question there of really whether, it marks a new strategy in terms of like how people get around and what can't happen anymore, for example. And it also suggests that a lot of action is required at the local level. So one of the quotes is, local authorities will have the power and ambition to make bold decisions. But if you look closely at the document, there's no clarity whatsoever on what those powers might be for local authorities. There's no proposals for statutory change to the powers that they have, and crucially, there's no doesn't seem to be any extra money for local authorities. But it does beg the question: what contribution can local authorities play in terms of rapid transport decarbonisation? Next slide. And that's really the basis of the project, which we're presenting very preliminary findings for here in this presentation. And to answer that question, we've been looking at 3 case study sites, Leeds, Oxford and Nottingham, with the first 2 looked at first, really. Nottingham hasn't been done so much yet by our research. And we chose these sites because we feel that there's some evidence of acceleration that we can learn from. Of course, nowhere in the UK has acceleration to the extent that is required. But what can we learn from these case study sites that might be generalizable, that might be interesting and important? So Leeds City Council has a net zero 2030 target, and arguably a much more ambitious decarbonisation strategy than lots of other places. Oxford has a strong record on sustainable transport and a 2040 target, and has started to get together an action plan. Nottingham did have one of the most significant reductions in per capita emissions since 2009, but arguably it's actually sort of leveled off, and we haven't seen a lot of progress since. Next slide. So these are measures of transport emissions since 2019 for local authorities. And there are 2 things to look at here. One is the absolute level of decarbonisation, and that's on the bottom axis there. And the other is the percentage change in per capita carbon emissions. So clearly the urban areas are going to have a better chance of per capita change because there's a more concentrated population, probably better public transport, etc. But that, there are differences between the urban areas too. We chose all of our case study sites from the bottom left there, so they've got better per capita carbon emission reductions and absolute levels too. But clearly local authorities are struggling with sort of a target inflation, if you like, that's happened over many years as the climate crisis has got worse, with new laws being passed and new targets being set by central government. Next slide. So the key contentions from our research is that local authorities play a role in accelerating short-term decarbonisation of transport. And that happens, we've heard in other presentations about the multi-level governance structure, and we argue it happens within that and in interaction with local civil society. And there's the dynamics of activism and citizens' involvement is very important, and of course also the private sector. And understanding local authority capacity, we argue, requires attention to the relationships between ambitions and action, the interactions with national government and actors at a local scale, and the path dependencies that have emerged in terms of imagining, institutionalizing and achieving change in local transport. So taking those sort of that framing and looking at the case study sites now, firstly with Leeds, next slide. This is a graph, I think it's coming up a bit blurry on my screen, so I'll try and describe it. But this is from the Leeds draft transport strategy, the latest one. And this, as I said, Leeds has got a net 2030, net zero 2030 target. It proposes that the green line at the top there is a 17% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. That's if they do nothing. And I think that comes from like more efficient engines and that sort of thing. But a series of big moves gets them, they think, a fair amount further. And that would lead, for an example, to a 400% increase in cycling in the next 10 years from a very, very low level, and a 30% decrease in car use, just to give a couple of examples. But that's only going to get us, I think, 42% of the way to the net zero 2030 target. Transport has to meet net zeros as every other sector does. So there's a gap there, and it's not meeting it. And there's a series of other measures that are required that are very ambiguous. I should say that in our case study sites, we've been interviewing politicians, officers from various different parts of the public sector, and activists and people from the private sector too. Next slide. But this is what we found from Leeds. Well, I've been doing the research on Leeds mainly myself, is that the climate emergency has become the linchpin of the city council's transport strategy. That's not something that had really happened before in Leeds. It was a thing to consider when drawing up local transport plans in conjunction with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, but it certainly wasn't one of the main sort of objectives for the transport strategy. And they've, one of the important links that we found through the interviews has been with the university. And that's allowed them to produce stuff like the graph that I just showed you, which actually shows a carbon budgeting and a real sort of grasping of what would be needed to actually happen to get to net zero, to get to their target. And the ambition for Leeds is a city where you don't need a car, which is a big thing arguably for the city, because it designed itself in the 1970s, 1960s as a city where you absolutely want a car, the motorway city. And so arguably, at least on a rhetorical level, it's trying to change very quickly into something else. And we found that the social movements that have sprung up, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, when we've seen real acceleration in ambition, if not in action, has been the actions of social movements like Extinction Rebellion and especially the climate strikes. But there's been many, many questions and grey areas. For example, the schemes, walking and cycling schemes, the ambition is still fairly limited on that. That there is, like other people said in this session, a fear of political acceptability, and that runs through many, many different things. It could be about the voting public, it could be about officers, councillors, it goes on. And the dependence they have as a city in terms of their plan on public transport improving, but not really having any powers or funding to do that. A lot of public transport is decided by Wicker. A lot of the funding would come from national government. And this further measures thing is a massive black hole. Apparently, it depends who you're speaking to, what it could involve, but it might involve national government doing a lot more, might involve some draconian road charging. but certainly isn't anything that's been worked out in detail. And there's a question of, are they demanding this from the national government? And the elephant in the room is the Leeds Bradford Airport expansion, which has been a hugely controversial thing. At the moment has been paused, but it's still really part of the plans and not included in the carbon budgeting. I think the next slide is this for you, Vasilia?
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna cover a bit the Oxford case study, try to be quick. So as mentioned by Tom, Oxford City has set a 24 net zero target with some residual emissions which are outside of the control of the local authority carry on for a few more years, as you can see in the slide. And these are especially linked to the carbon intensity of the grid. And targets are not new to the city of Oxford, which, for example, in 2005, had already set a 40% CO2 emission reduction target, which was achieved in 2020. In the slide, you can see some of the targets has been set by the new Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, which sets to build also on the outcomes of the Citizen Assembly held in 2019. The documents, which has been released a month ago, states new bold transport goals and pathways, especially focused on fleet electrification. You can see the increasing number of street EV chargers, and also streamlining with a goal of reducing the number of private cars by over 28,000 units. And there's also quite an ambitious target for public transport. And also at the county level, a new local transport connectivity plan is on the making under the overarching strategy of conducting Oxfordshire, which has repeatedly committed to implementing a zero emission zone in Oxford City, also board parking levy, and different interventions for active travel. And further targets for walking and cycling also been set as part of the Oxford local cycling and walk infrastructure plan. And Oxford in general has a long track record of encouraging sustainable transport, with action which, as we saw, are mostly led by the county, but concentrated at the city level. And most of the ongoing projects build on earlier successes and have been not generally framed around broadly than the climate emergency. So we see a joint framing around air pollution, economic growth, reducing congestion, and now more and more emerging the climate emergency, also thanks to the climate strikes and the citizen assemblies held in 2019. And what we're seeing with the interviews and also with the literal analysis, we've seen the Oxford City Council is a very interesting case study for a strong reliance on project logic and stakeholder partnership, with Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership be only one of the last one of a series of partnership going back a decade or so, which they use to attract funding and implement change, often borrowing a language and tools typical of the private sector. And lately, also the county has adopted a similar logic and adopted new innovative institutional forms, for example, setting up the Innovation Hub. And we consider in general these new endogenous strategies are developed also in response to changes to funding mechanism at the national and international level. One final thing to say on Oxford City is that in many of the documents I reviewed, there is a recognition of the limited influence and capacity of action that the local authority will have on the transport sector, with the recognized need to lobbying at the national government. And similarly, there is a reflection on the two-tier system in place, which is seen as potentially challenging when aiming to achieve rapid carbon changes, especially when the ambition at the city level are held up by the slower pace and slower ambition at the level of the rural districts. So just briefly, what lessons can be learned from this preliminary analysis? Certainly, in both case studies, we're observing that for many years, the climate emergency has been subsuming under wider policy goal and used as a source, among many others, to legitimize specific transport interventions. However, this is now shifting, and we can trace a slow discursive acceleration, for example, and especially in direct response to citizen actions. And in the interviews, the climate strikes have been reported as a key event after which decarbonisation became a key theme of policy. Such acceleration, however, seems to constitute more of an opportunistic shift we can call it a rebranding exercise, for example, to enable the local authorities to attract further funding to deliver projects which were already in their portfolio, especially when we're talking about electrification or existing pedestrianization plans. Therefore, the acceleration remains only at the level of rhetorical ambition and is not backed up by capacity to bring out change more quickly or to undertake more substantial projects. And we see this lack of capacity linked by the interviewees themselves to the lack of support, both financial and regulatory, by the national government. And personally also by a lack of local capacities, for example, to deal with the backlash when they're going about introducing, for example, LTNs, but also with the lack of capacity to deliver appropriate plans. So there is a risk we see in this first analysis that future action will reveal a discrepancy also between the local authorities' toolkit for decarbonization, which is very concentrated, for example, in electrification, and the activist views on the need to tackle car dependency and the links between transport and wider urban problems, especially with regard to environmental risk or risk posed by housing affordability. Going back to the initial slides and the discussion on the TDP, our preliminary analysis of these two case studies suggests that the plans claim that local authorities will have the power and ambition to make bold local decisions rings very hollow. Yes, we've seen there is acceleration in ambitions, but there are no corresponding proportional strengthening of local authority capacity. And based on what we found so far, we're skeptical that the toolkit that the local authorities have been promised in the TDP will be offering extra help, especially for those local authorities that have been trying to accelerate transport decarbonization for some time. And you can see on the slide the kind of screenshot of the toolkit that's been presented in the TDP, in one of the pages of the TDP. So we see that without changes in how local authorities are capacitated by national government, it is unclear how step change towards drastic reduction in CO2 emission can be achieved, and which makes very skeptical about meeting the 6 carbon budget on time. LA's local authorities, in this context, local authorities are doing what they can. However, they definitely beefed up their ambitions and they're trying to realize them for the most, however, with fairly well-known concrete interventions. So there's very little innovation and risk-taking. And for those interventions which are taking some new risks, there's a very disproportionate attention as such in the case of LTNs. But effectively, the transport decarbonization plan leaves the local authorities being the rock of the national policies and the hard place of local civil society frustration. So what we're seeing in the case studies, if on the one hand, the transport decarbonization plan delegates responsibilities for decarbonizing to the lower level authorities without effectively capacitating them. On the other hand, the combination of ambition and action presented by or used by the local authority, it's at odds with the more radical or progressive part of the civil society. This, at least in the university series we have been analyzing, and the role of university would be something we need to look at in the future. And so the transport decarbonization plan, and this concept can, so come back also to the initial analysis, we can read this as a passing on the hot potato of transport decarbonization across space and time. So if one hand is going down to the local authorities, but it's also going far away in time, perhaps for now avoiding alienating some of the conservative votes, but ineffectively making very difficult in a few years' time the car cuts will be very deep, even more deeper than they already are. And this situation our assumption is this situation might even fuel the frustration of many local actors, and we might face even more social unrest with social movements and participation in citizen juries and assemblies, for whom the radical changes is not really happening. And there many.
You need to finish up now.
Yeah, it's my last. So just to, yeah. So this was like the final reflection I wanted to share with you, and of course there's an open question. We hope to build on this and deliver more findings in the next months when we manage to analyze the third case studies and also reflect a bit more on our interviews. Okay, thank you.